So if you've been here the last two Sundays, you probably remember that we've looked at stories from two times in John when Jesus met with people he normally wouldn't interact with. First, Jesus had a discussion with Nicodemus, a rabbi and a Pharisee, one of the member of the strictest branch of Judaism at that time. And then last Sunday we read how Jesus met with a Samaritan woman while he and the disciples were traveling back home to Galilee. Today we're looking at another meeting that Jesus had that had, I guess, unexpected results is probably the way to say that. Most Sundays my habit is to read the whole text and then get into the message, but today's text story is fairly long, so I'm going to switch it up. I'm going to try to explain it as I read it in sections. We're still in the Gospel of John, but we're in the 9th chapter, and by the time we're done, we're going to read the whole chapter there. So let's dive in. So I'm going to start with verse 1. As Jesus was walking along, he saw a man who had been blind from birth. Rabbi, his disciples asked him, "Why was this man born blind? Was it because of his own sins or his parents' sins?" "It was not because of his sins or his parents' sins," Jesus answered. "This happened so the power of God could be seen in him. We must quickly carry out the task assigned to us by the one who sent us. The night is coming, and then no one can work. But while I'm here in the world, I am the light of the world." Then he spit on the ground, made mud with the saliva, and spread the mud over the blind man's eyes. He told him, "Go wash yourself in the pool of Siloam." Siloam means sent. So the man went and washed and came back seeing. You know, I don't know that I've ever seen a blind person begging on the streets here in the U.S., but we saw plenty of blind people begging. Oftentimes they were singing or they were playing musical instruments on sidewalks. Technically that's busking, I guess. We saw that in Cambodia all the time. They would be on a street corner and someone would have a box with a slot in it to put money in. They'd pass it around as we were stopped on motorcycles or in tuk-tuks or what have you like that at lights waiting there. But you know, even today in developing nations, blindness is a much more common affliction than it is here in the U.S. And in many places, there is still very little institutional or societal help for people with disabilities such as blindness. Here, a child born blind, as this man was, usually can attend special schools, be offered aids, get a seeing eye dog, learn to read, get an education, and quite often live a self-supporting life. Many vision problems can be treated and corrected, but even if they cannot, we are blessed to live in a place and a time when something like this does not sentence a person to a life of misery or a life where they need to rely on other people for every need in their lives. But this was not the case in the first century world. People with disabilities could not do the physical work that almost everyone did. They couldn't dig ditches or build houses or work stone or do handicrafts generally. So they were usually reduced to some form of begging, sitting on the street hoping people would take pity on them and help them out in some way, some spare change, some food, something like that. Plus, in most cultures, those afflicted with what we'd class as disabilities were believed to be getting what they deserved. This was the case here in John 9. The disciples see this man. They say, "Teacher, who sinned that this guy should be born blind, him or his parents?" See, this was a common mindset. If you were cursed with blindness or some other disability from birth, it was because God was punishing you for some sin. Here, they wondered, did this guy's parents sin? Is that what caused their son to be born blind? Or was it something that he did while he was still in the womb, before he was born? Think about that. Maybe he sinned before he was born, and that's why he was born blind. The implications of that are pretty wild. Because to them, it obviously had to be one or the other. And Jesus says, neither. This wasn't because of his or his parents' sin. And right here in this verse, the New Living Translation, which is my current favorite translation, it fails us because it makes it seem as like Jesus goes on to say, no, he was born blind and has lived this miserable life up to now so that I could show you how awesome God is today. Now, the issue is grammatically technical, so I'm not going to bore you with the reasons or try to throw some Greek at you or something like that, try to impress you. But I didn't just make this up. I found it in several sources. The text could just as easily read, "Neither this man sinned nor his parents, but so that the works of God might be displayed in him, we must do the work of him who sent me." So that has Jesus saying, neither, but we're going to show you how awesome God is by healing him today. You see, Jesus was speaking against this type of idea that illness and suffering are always a direct result of wrongdoing. They're always because of sin of some type. At the very least, Jesus is saying, fellas, it's way more complicated than your sin equals suffering formula that you have in your heads. What people believed and what many people in the world still default to when they think about hardships and suffering in life was a lot more like the Buddhist or the Hindu concept of karma than it is any true Jewish or Christian teaching from the Bible. If you do bad, bad things happen to you. If you do good, good things happen to you. That is karma, not anything that the Bible teaches. Sometimes we do suffer because of as the direct consequences of some sin, either ours or someone else's. But more often than not, you cannot connect suffering or tragedies to some specific individual sin. Not everyone who gets cancer had bad health habits that caused them to do that or something like that. Sometimes people just get cancer and we can't say, oh, it's because he smoked, because she spent too much time out in the sun or something like that. Sometimes it just happens. We say bad luck. We don't technically believe in luck, but sometimes chance is a part of it because we live in a fallen world. Jesus said, God causes the rain to fall on the righteous and the unrighteous. In other words, suffering is often just a consequence of living in a fallen world, a world that is still influenced by sin, that is not 100% redeemed yet. And it's usually not because the sufferer did something wrong. And after he makes this point, Jesus does a weird thing. It seems weird to me, at least. He makes a little mud pie, a little mud salve there out of dirt and his spit, and he wipes it on the guy's eyes. And he tells him to go wash the mud off in a specific pool there in Jerusalem. And John says the guy does this, and afterwards he can see. And it's a miracle. So everybody go and celebrate and then go back to normal life, right? Well, maybe not. Picking up at verse 8. His neighbors and others who knew him as a blind beggar asked each other, "Isn't this the man who used to sit and beg?" Some said he was, and others said, no, he just looks like him. But the beggar kept saying, "Yes, I am the same one." They asked, "Who healed you? What happened?" He told them, "The man they called Jesus made mud and spread it over my eyes and told me, 'Go to the pool of Siloam and wash yourself.' So I went and washed, and now I can see." "Where is he now?" they asked. "I don't know," he replied. So the guy gets back from the Siloam Municipal Miracle Pool, and instead of being happy for him, his neighbors are all up in arms about what's happened here. Were they just being nosy troublemakers? Maybe. But, if you were the person in that time, in that day and age, that you believe that his blindness came about because of his sin or his family's sin, and that certainty of that justified your indifference and your self-righteous attitude towards him and his family, then all of a sudden, he's healed. And that apple cart, the way you think, your view of how things work in the world is all upset. They're saying, "I always knew that I was better than them." But now their blind son can see. Where's the evidence of my relative righteousness now? What do I hold over them since he can see just like my children can see? How can I then think I'm better than them? See, here's Jesus stirring up trouble, causing the whole neighborhood to re-examine their prejudices. And it's about to get worse. Verse 13. Then they took the man who had been blind to see the Pharisees. because it was on the Sabbath that Jesus had made the mud and healed him. The Pharisees asked the man all about it. So he told them, "He put the mud over my eyes, and when I washed it away, I could see." Some of the Pharisees said, "This man Jesus is not from God, for he is working on the Sabbath." Others said, "But how could an ordinary sinner do such miraculous signs?" So there was a deep division of opinion among them. Then the Pharisees again questioned the man who had been blind and demanded, "What's your opinion about this man who healed you?" The man replied, "I think he must be a prophet." The Jewish leaders still refused to believe the man had been blind and could now see, so they called in his parents. They asked them, "Is this your son? Was he born blind? If so, how can he now see?" His parents replied, "We know that this is our son and that he was born blind, but we don't know how he can see or who healed him. Ask him. He is old enough to speak for himself." His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders who had announced that anyone saying Jesus was the Messiah would be expelled from the synagogue. That's why they said, "He is old enough, ask him." So the neighborhood busybodies, they said, "Let's go see what the local Pharisee council makes of this." And these guys say, "What happened?" And the formerly blind guy tells a story again. And some of the Pharisees say, "Well, this is troubling. I mean, it's Saturday. It's the Sabbath. No truly godly person works on a Sabbath." See, the Old Testament commands, "You shall not work on a Sabbath. It is holy. Keep it to the Lord." And they had all these rules of what quantified and what qualified as work. And they said healing someone, even performing a miracle on a Sabbath, was work and therefore could not be done that day. So they said, well, therefore he's a sinner because he worked on a Sabbath. So this Jesus fellow isn't doing God's work, they said. But the other Pharisees said, well, hold on a second. If it wasn't God, then what other explanation is there? And this is where it becomes almost comical, at least ironic. "Okay," they asked, "now, Mr. Now I can see. What do you think of this Jesus guy who healed you?" And he answers, "Well, I suppose he's been sent by God with a message." That's what a prophet was, a person who was sent by God with a message. And they said, "Yeah, he must be from God." And they don't like that answer, so they say, "Well, let's ask his parents about this. This your boy? Was he born blind? If so, how do you account for the fact that he can now see?" They said, "Well, he's our son, and he was blind when he was born. As for his sudden sightedness, you ask him. He's grown. You know, he's not a kid. He can speak for himself." See, they could see where this was heading, so they threw their son under the bus just a little bit, because they didn't want to become even more outcast than what they were. And I imagine at that point someone stood up and said, "This is getting us nowhere. Bring the beggar back in." And then we're going to pick up here at verse 24. So for the second time, they called in the man who had been blind and told him, "God should get the glory for this, because we know this man Jesus is a sinner." "I don't know whether he is a sinner," the man replied, "but I know this. I was blind, and now I can see." "But what did he do?" they asked. "How did he heal you?" "Look," the man exclaimed, "I told you once. Didn't you listen? Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciples too?" Then they cursed him and said, "You are his disciple, but we are the disciples of Moses. We know God spoke to Moses, but we don't even know where this man comes from." "Why, that's very strange," the man replied. "He healed my eyes, and yet you don't know where he comes from. We know that God doesn't listen to sinners, but he is ready to hear those who worship him and do his will. Ever since the world began, no one has been able to open the eyes of someone born blind. If this man were not from God, he couldn't have done it." "You were born a total sinner," they answered. "Are you trying to teach us?" And they threw him out of the synagogue. You know, like I alluded to, this story could almost be a comedy if it wasn't so tragic. The Pharisees were done by this point with any logical arguments. Now they just want this fellow to say that Jesus obviously had nothing to do with this miraculous healing. And why is that? Because they just knew that he was a sinner. It was the Sabbath. And a good Jew doesn't do any kind of work on the Sabbath. Just give God, they said, just give God, not Jesus, credit for this miracle. Jesus couldn't have done it since he's obviously a sinner. Look, it's Saturday. But the guy who'd woken up that morning blind said, well, I don't know about his spiritual status. However, I do know that I was blind, but now I see. They said, yes, but how? How did he heal you? And you can hear the exasperation in his answer back to them. He says, I told you once already, did I stutter? Say, maybe you guys want to become his disciples too, his followers. And this is beyond the pale for the Pharisees. You may follow him, but we follow Moses. God spoke to Moses, we know that, but we don't know anything about this Jesus fellow or where he comes from. And even though this guy had no education, Braille hadn't been invented yet, he couldn't read, he's not stupid. Well, he says, this is quite the conundrum. He healed me, but you're still wondering if God was the source of his healing power. If he was a sinner, would God give him this ability to heal me? Has anyone else in history, recorded history, ever done what he did today? It seems to me that if God wasn't behind it, there's no way it could have happened. At this point, they're so furious that they commit yet another logical fallacy. You were born blind, they said, a proven sinner from the womb. So why would we ever listen to anything that you say? And they kicked him out of the building and out of their community. He was no longer welcome at Sabbath services in that synagogue. Okay, let's finish the story, picking up at verse 35. When Jesus heard what had happened, he found the man and asked, do you believe in the Son of Man? The man answered, who is he, sir? I want to believe in him. You have seen him, Jesus said, and he is speaking to you. Yes, Lord, I believe, the man said, and he worshiped Jesus. Then Jesus told him, I entered this world to render judgment, to give sight to the blind, and to show those who think they see that they are blind. Some Pharisees who were standing nearby heard him and asked, are you saying we're blind? If you were blind, you wouldn't be guilty, Jesus replied, but you remain guilty because you claim you can see. So somehow word got back to Jesus about the formerly blind man's rhetorical tussle with the Pharisees, and Jesus went and found him. This probably wasn't a difficult thing to do. They were probably all in the same neighborhood in Jerusalem there. And in many countries yet today, life is lived outside and in public a whole lot more than it generally is in our culture, especially here in the northern climates where it's not so warm outside much of the year. So Jesus then asks him, he finds him, he says, do you believe in the Son of Man? And to us, if someone were to refer to themselves as the Son of Man, that would be an odd way of referring to yourself. But it was understood by the Israelites of Jesus' day to have messianic overtones. So the newly sighted man says, I'd like to believe in him. Point him out to me. Now you remember, this guy hadn't actually seen Jesus until right then, because Jesus, he put the mud on his eyes and said, have someone take you to the pool of Siloam, you wash that mud off. But then when the man came back and he was sighted, Jesus was no longer there. So it wasn't until this time Jesus found him and he said, do you believe in the Son of Man? Do you believe in me? He was a little bit coded there. And as Jesus did, just as he did with the Samaritan woman at the well, he answered very straightforwardly. He says, the guy says, point him out to me. Who is the Son of Man you're talking about? He goes, you're looking at him. It's me. And then John tells us the guy said, I believe you are who you say you are. And he worshiped Jesus. And then Jesus does something kind of curious. And one translation puts it this way: my coming into this world is itself a judgment. Those who cannot see have their eyes opened, and those who think they can see become blind. Did you ever watch any of the various iterations of the CSI, the crime scene investigation shows on TV? What do they do when they get to a crime scene after they've cataloged everything? Then they, at one point, they spray a chemical reagent over the crime scene, Usually they call it luminol. I don't know what actually is in it. But then what they do is they then turn off the overhead lights and turn on a black light. And that causes everything with protein, all the nasty bodily fluids that we can't normally see, the blood and everything else, and spit and whatnot, that all fluoresce. And at that point, we're all thankful that we can't see that kind of stuff all the time, right? But in a way, that's what Jesus did. Not only did he make the blind see, but he revealed where many people's blind spots are. If we listen to him, he shows us all the things that we would just as soon ignore. So some Pharisees overheard him say this to this fellow, and they caught on that he was throwing some shade their way, and they said, "Wait, are you saying that we're blind?" And Jesus, and this is my paraphrase as always, says, "Not really, but in a way, yes. If you were blind," and here he meant blind meaning ignorant, if you were not paying attention, didn't see this stuff, you wouldn't be guilty. But since you have set yourselves up as authorities on what is right and what is wrong, then you are going to be held accountable. Now, for those who haven't yet truly seen and met Jesus, this is a story of hope. It's a story of salvation. It's the promise of a better life. I once was lost, but now I'm found. I was blind, but now I see. However, for those of us who claim to have seen and known Jesus for some time, this is a story of warning. It's not only the Pharisees who can be so sure that they're right, that they miss what God is really doing in someone's life. It's possible for us to see and yet be spiritually blind. And Jesus is calling us all the time to have our eyes open, to see those around us, to not always be so sure we know exactly how God works and what He's going to do. Would you pray with me? Heavenly Father, we often come to your word for comfort, and it's always there, but also we learn from your word, we learn from your Son and from his teaching that we are not supposed to be comfortable with everything that we think we know. So I just ask you would help me, that you help all of us who know your Son Jesus to truly see others, to see with eyes of compassion, to see with eyes of curiosity, to truly know that those around us might be blind and that they need to see you and come to know you so they can truly see their lives and understand their place in your world. Help us, Father, to have our eyes open, have our hearts open, to recognize that you are doing things that we can't even see at this point. Send your Spirit upon us. Open our eyes, Father. In Jesus' name we ask these things. Amen.